everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Kari Paul, and I'm a technology reporter based in San Francisco at the West Coast Bureau for The Guardian US. I cover diversity and labor issues in the tech world and the gig economy, as well as some surveillance and privacy and cybersecurity issues. So I am looking forward to hearing from our awesome panelists today. We have Sidney Prescott, who is the global head of intelligent automation at the music streaming service Spotify. She works there with robotic processing automation and artificial intelligence. We will also hear from Hallie Bregman, the global head of people analytics at computer software firm PTC, where she drives talent strategy, DEI, and recruiting. And finally, we have Lucinda Sanders, the co-founder and CEO at the National Center for Women in Information Technology, where she works to increase the number of women in computer fields. So let's get started. I'll just dive into some questions just about the world of STEM and all of your experiences in that. So let's start with Sidney. I was just wondering if you could start by talking a little bit about how you got into the space and whether, as you pursued your career in STEM, you ever faced any hurdles, whether it was, representation, not seeing people who were like you in the field you were going into, or anything else, and how did you address that?
Absolutely. So excited to be here. I started my career in STEM. It's a little bit serendipitous, I would say. As I was in university, during my junior year, I started an internship. And it was specifically to look at software contracts within the technology sector. I had no idea that would actually lead me into a career in technology. But as I started that role, it was within a configuration and asset management team, a global team. And I just fell in love with the space, everything from working with other technologists around the world, the ins and outs of how you work with these different engineers, the workflows. It really was very exciting for me. And it was something where I could be creative and innovative within the space at the same time, which you don't necessarily think of. And then I did unfortunately face some challenges in this journey, primarily because my background was not in computer science. So my background is actually in philosophy. I was planning to go to law school at the time, and so that's why I started the contract internship. But as I moved forward with my career, and I had a lot of mentors around me, I began to, and they were encouraging me to continue a career in technology. I began to get feedback, unfortunately, from peers in terms of the fact that I did not have a computer science degree and that I had a humanities degree instead. And so that for me was a big challenge, actually, when I first started my career, pushing back against the notion of what it means to be a technologist and what it means in terms of the education track that you follow throughout your career. And since then, I've gotten my MBA. I'm planning actually to do another degree, but I still sometimes get that pushback in terms of, oh, you didn't start out in computer science, and then also push back, of course, on being a female in technology, being a woman of color in technology. There's a lot of different nuances there that we could dive into.
Yeah, I'm interested. I'm sure you also got some benefits from having a humanities degree. Like, is there any way you think that having that different background brought a new perspective to your career that maybe others didn't have?
Oh, absolutely. So I always champion humanities majors to have to start a career in technology. I think that the critical thinking skills that I acquired during my degree program, as well as the heavy focus on logic, it actually is the same type of logic that we use in programming. So it really did benefit me. And it's very interesting, the ethical perspective as well. So as we're starting to dive into artificial intelligence, intelligence, there's a lot of buzz around the ethics surrounding the technologies that we're building. And this is where your philosophy majors, your philosophers, your ethicists can really provide a lot of great context about the ways that the technology we're building will impact the different segments of society. So I definitely think it's a unique perspective, but it's also very much one that is needed as we continue to basically evolve what it means to interface with all of these different tools as a human being.
And I'd just like to pivot to Hallie now, as you are involved in D&I. How can we encourage that variety of backgrounds, and whether it's, the variety of educational backgrounds and different humanities versus technology, and also, of course, gender and racial diversity in tech?
Yeah, so what Sidney shares really resonates with me. I started as someone who loved math. In high school, I took calculus. I loved it. And no one, ever said, like, go study that. And so I became a psychologist and spent years in social sciences, actually got my PhD in this space. And in that time, I found I loved research. I loved the data. I loved doing that manipulation and analysis. And so I also have really benefited from having a degree outside of computer science, but also found it, played into imposter syndrome. I sometimes felt like I wasn't right for that space. And what I can say to others is 100%, no matter what your background is, there is a place for you in technology. It is a culture of learning and growing, and that is technology by definition, right? Things change constantly. And so even the people who studied computer science, well, they studied, C++ or something else that was popular 10 years ago. And today it's all about Python or Kubernetes or whatever it might be. And so I think, there's really an open-mindedness that is needed in this space, and often comes, especially in working at innovative technology companies. I have found, especially in the startup world, that folks were like, who cares what you studied? Great, you're good at this? Good, do it. And that's actually how I kind of entered technology. I got a job at a small startup. They used some software that I already knew, and I was like, cool. I don't know anything about, CPG, consumer packaged goods, or the survey platform you're building, but I can do this. And it was a great opportunity. And so I think, it's all about being open-minded and kind to yourself and saying, well, I can do this, and not just about what others are willing to, give you the opportunity to do as well.
And I know maybe some of that focuses on recruitment and getting diverse candidates to come to jobs. But I'm curious if Lucinda could talk a little bit about changing the culture within companies. What are some of the systemic challenges facing women in tech right now? And what are the responsibilities that companies have to address these systemic deficiencies?
First of all, I want to say hearing Sidney and Hallie talk about their different backgrounds is exactly what computing needs. So keep going. Just a reminder, computer science is a new discipline, relatively speaking, and it was formed by a lot of people such as yourselves. And it's not done yet. So keep going. Those are great stories. One of the things that really is holding, I would say, all underrepresented groups back in the computing tech space is this lack of an inclusive culture. So for those listening today, you have a majority minority situation going on for women in tech. And I want to clarify that not all women are the same. We come from a number of different intersecting identities, and we react to cultures and thrive in cultures differently, one from the other. So I'm going to make some general statements about women, but please do know that we're all different, right, in our own ways, and face different challenges, I would say. So the one thing underlying all of this is that it's a minority majority situation. And I think people listening today can probably all remember a time when they felt like they were the only one of. I'm the only philosophy student in a team of computing people. I'm the only Black woman in the room, or I'm the only man at the PTO meeting up at school, and we can remember what that's like. And that kind of dynamic causes some cultural dysfunction, because majority cultures come from majority groups. And so there's a lot to be said around different research around microinequities, which you might have heard about. A little drip of, oh, Kari actually has a good idea, or, checking cell phones when a woman speaks, because they're not really paying attention, or the things that we kind of know happen. There's imposter syndrome, also related to stereotype threat, like I don't belong. Those are the number of things that are in a culture, can be in a culture in a minority majority situation. And it tends to demotivate, it tends to get people to leave. So we know, for example, that although the pipeline for women in tech needs work, but we can't blame that, because we know when women hit the private sector, they leave their private sector tech jobs at a rate of 56% by mid-career, and they're not leaving the workforce. 3/4 of them stay in the workforce. So we've got work to do in the culture, and it's an all hands on deck. I mean, we may talk about that later. It requires all of us to work on being more inclusive.
And what does that work look like? How can we change these cultures from the inside or out? Is it, internal audits of how our culture is affecting others, or external, or what are some of the processes that we can go through to make sure that people do want to stay at these jobs and do feel welcome?
Well, we know that inclusive cultures are really built at the team level. And so because people feel excluded by their day-to-day interactions they encounter, by the meetings they go to, by if their ideas are given value, if they have influence in the work that the team is doing. So the first thing to know is that we can all do pretty simple things to have a more inclusive team, making sure we're paying attention to whose voices are being heard, making sure that we're monitoring interruptions, and it doesn't have to be a buzzkill. It can be very collegial. It can be, oh, Hallie didn't get to finish her thought. Let's go back around and pick that thought up. So that's one thing that we all can do to make sure our teams are inclusive and really own it. The other thing is just the spirit of inquiry. You're like asking one question, and probably as a reporter, you ask lots of questions, but it's like, well, what do you mean Lucy's not a natural born leader? Like, what do you even mean by that? And it's like, chances are good they don't know what they mean by that. They're just saying it. And it's a way to sort of have a conversation. So net, it's really working as a team, thinking about simple practices that we can all put to work on our own teams and have people feel included and valued. And then calling people in. This isn't meant to be confrontational. Although I have to say there are some times where it does need to be confrontational, as in very overt cases, of bias and discrimination, but calling people in to have an inclusive culture and working on it together.
And on the pipeline side of things, Hallie, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about recruitment and hiring. I know we're often seeing startups grow at kind of a breakneck pace, and how do you balance that fast growth with also being mindful and deliberate about the candidates that you're recruiting?
Yeah, I really want to be thoughtful here about the jump straight to recruiting after talking about inclusive culture. And I think the thing that people miss the most often when they jump straight to recruiting is that recruiting is not the solution. It is a Band-Aid, right? It is a piece of the puzzle. You have to recruit in order to increase representation, right? There have to be new people coming in if there's not enough people in your organization. But fundamentally, the root cause is always around the culture at play, and recruiting becomes a lot easier when you have a culture where people feel psychologically safe. And when I think about the number one thing that a company can do to help recruit more people of color, more underrepresented minorities in other dimensions, it is build a psychologically safe culture. And that can mean talking about hard things. That can be done in a safe way. And I think it's something that a lot of companies still, we're all talking a lot. There's a lot of buzz in technology right now, I think in society right now, but certainly in technology companies, that there's more we need to do around DEI. We want to be inclusive employers, but there's still a lot of discomfort around really looking at, I work in data day in and day out, and I see where there are gaps. And I see people's response to when I talk about those gaps. It's something I've become very comfortable doing. It's my job. I spend a lot of time looking at inequities where there might exist in this workplace and prior workplaces. But certainly it is a place where we need to be thoughtful about safety in talking about those and being comfortable with recognizing those inequities. And I think now bringing it back to recruiting, when we get there, right, when it's time to start saying, okay, how do we open up the floodgates to all of those tremendous new candidates who are entering the workforce with humanities backgrounds, with, exposure to different things and different cultures and different experiences, and are not all white and male, right? There are great white men too, but not all white and male. It is, they're going to want to come work for me. I can't just make them come here. They may, even if they exist, I can't just make them come here. It is putting into play relationships, showing them the communities, the ERGs, the et cetera, in place in my workplace that will help ultimately draw them in. So there's lots of tools in the toolbox to start to find them, right? Whether it's sourcing them directly and doing things like this, where you can draw in audiences who can learn and engage and know that there is a place for them to grow in their career and kind of pick up new skills on the job. But fundamentally, it's all about that psychological safety.
And you mentioned ERGs and other, internal organizations. Could you explain to maybe people who don't know what that is and how it benefits folks?
Yeah, ERG stands for Employee Resource Group. And Employee Resource Group is something that has become quite popular. And I'd say the last decade, I've started seeing them crop up. And these are communities of people who oftentimes start via grassroots efforts. All of the women get together and say, hey, we're women in tech. We're underrepresented. Let's band together and make a group, right? And sometimes that gets formalized and is officially an ERG. And sometimes it is, kind of still grassroots. But it means there are others like you. And it is finding the others like you who can understand your experiences, who can help advocate for you, who can cheerlead for you when you're going to go ask for a raise and you're nervous, right? And they might be able to organize some programming to give you some tips and tricks. There might be some mentorship programs that come through that. There's a real push right now to start to even migrate employee resource groups, these communities, to business resource groups to really prove the business value. We know it's there, but prove the business value of having people of color in your workplace. Prove the business value of having women in tech, using those groups to help partner with outside communities to help draw in additional talent and share the story of what it's like to work at those companies.
Yeah, and I was wondering if maybe some other panelists would want to weigh in on the business benefits of diversity and the technological benefits of diversity. I know Sidney touched on this a bit, just the diversity in AI kind of impacting the final product. We've seen a lot of implicit bias baked into AI and how we program different technology. And I guess we're finding that technology is not an objective product. It's kind of a product of all of the biases of the people who make it. So how do you think AI and other technologies would be different if there was more diversity involved in its development?
I would just say that it starts during the initial development life cycle. So it starts with the ideation process. And as you walk through as a developer, how you will execute a technological solution to a business problem. And what we find is the more diverse that team is. And I think of it as diversity of thought. So when you have individuals that are coming from different backgrounds, different age groups, quite often we think, diversity of, ethnicity. And it's really more than that. It's diversity of age, of experience, of gender, of race. So, and it goes on and on. But having a team, when you build your teams within these groups that have that mixture of individuals in the team, you get a very strong mixture of perspectives. You get a very diverse way of thinking about executing on a problem. And what I've seen from working with teams of engineers who or have, maybe there's women, there's men, there's, young professionals, mid-career, it really enhances the conversations that you have as you start to develop your workflows. And it really does enhance the end product that you deliver. So I think there's a lot of value there, just even workshopping through what it takes to build something out as a software engineer when you have those diverse voices in the room.
And I'll just add to what Sidney said. There's a book called The Difference by Scott Page. And I believe he has a second book out now where he uses analytical modeling to prove a lot of what Sidney was talking about, with a very important caveat that these teams need to be, very creatively and carefully managed, because one of the things that gets you broader innovation is, of course, the diverse, pull and different lived experiences and things like that. So that gets back to the inclusive culture and inclusive leadership skills. One other really important thing that we're starting to study now is when we talk about DEI, we often count numbers, like we have 10 of Y and 3 of X and 5 of Z. But in fact, we're starting to see some pretty significant sub-segregation in technology fields. And so when we see those who are underrepresented in computing in the support roles and not in necessarily in their fair numbers, the lead creative roles, then innovation suffers, right? And so, I think that is a pretty significant scientific endeavor to go after that and really understand all of that. But those of you listening who want a different set of metrics to go and collect, start looking at influence and influential roles. And I'll just say one metric that you may know or you may not know. We do a patenting study, a gendered patenting study, and we use the US patent database because it's public, and we use software to crawl the patent database and assign a gender. Unfortunately, it's binary, but but it's the best we can do on such a big data source. To assign gender to each inventor of each IT patent. With me so far? Right, and then we add it all up. And women make up only 2%, women-only invention teams of all IT patents, and men 88%. So depending on how you feel about patenting, you could love it, you could hate it, right? But it's an innovation metric, and it's showing, at least at some level. Also, we have research papers in different areas of computer science research that show sub-segregations going on. So just again, maybe this is a call to action to really care about influence and innovation as part of our DEI work.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if any other panelists want to weigh in on that idea of diversity, not just being numbers, but also who is in leadership roles and the diversity of thought within a company.
It's all about the growth mindset. And this is kind of how the literature talks about it. Open-mindedness to people being able to learn and grow. Again, on the job, we talked about this before, where innovation's changing so fast. And so when I think about the numbers, right, the who's here, it's important because it's who you can see, and then you can see others like you. But more importantly, it's to be able to identify those gaps I talked about. So if I don't know who's here, I can't tell you where there are gaps, right? You, Lucy, are using some great software to try to suss out identity and gender based on some algorithms and some software. It's a lot easier if you tell me who you are, right? And I know truly how you identify. And then I can say, well, you identify differently than this group, and these experiences are different. And there's a lot of metrics we use in technology, data that's already available. And thinking back to kind of what we were just talking about with being the only, this is a concept I've looked into a lot, where if you are the only person of color on a team of all white people, that's a very different experience than if you are the only person of color on a team with a white person, somebody who's Asian, somebody who is gay, somebody who is Jewish, somebody who is, right, there's lots of onlys. And if it's lots of onlys, then innovation is definitely kind of top of mind. And again, you do that by collecting the data and getting folks to identify so that you can understand the composition. But the goal is not simply to measure, is there composition differences, right? It is to measure the impact on inclusion and belonging in the workplace. And fundamentally, that is what drives innovation.
And I feel there's been a lot of discussion of mentorship in the STEM fields, whether formally or informally. And I'm curious what you think the role of mentorship is in increasing diversity and representation in tech. I don't know if maybe Lucinda wants to start.
Sure. I'm going to also turn it over quickly to Hallie and Sidney. Maybe I'll just put a few words on the table, because mentoring to me, as they're advisors, they're friends, they're going to help you understand about the opportunities or the kinds of things you can do, and they'll advocate for you. But I want to put sponsor on the table too, because sponsors are people who spend political capital on you. They will take a risk. They will stick their neck out. They generally are well positioned to do so in an organization. They may have a lot of power or something like that. And oftentimes you don't know if you have a sponsor or not. You don't know who they are, because you can't have a formal program around sponsorship, really, because you can't force somebody to take a risk for you. And then ally, because I think we'll come back to allies maybe later. And an ally could be a mentor or a sponsor. They could be all overlapped. But they also help work towards inclusive culture. So they are an ally towards building inclusive cultures. We have a lot of men ask us how they can be, allies. And it really is taking on the system and removing systemic bias and mitigating bias in the majority system itself. So those are just some words I wanted to throw out there. I think they're all important. And I would say in general that majority group, in this case, men, come to these things more naturally, and they don't see the need to be an ally to change the system because the system is often theirs. So when they want to step out and become an ally to remove systemic bias from these systems, that's really awesome.
Hallie, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. I think one of the things we see in the data is that people are more successful when they are more connected. And so mentorship as a concept is lovely, right? It's the idea of building a connection to someone you might not have otherwise had access to or connection to learn from them. But I think Lucinda's quite right when she talks about sponsorship. And, there's lots of buzzwords out there. It's coaching, is it sponsorship, is it mentorship? And how do you actually define what each person is? And I think she raises a great point that sometimes you don't know who your sponsors are. So it's not so easy to be like, oh, hey, Sidney, will you be my sponsor? You can't really ask that in the same way people feel like they might be able to say, hey, would you be my mentor? Would you meet with me once a month and kind of coach me through some of these situations? And maybe over time we build that relationship and Sidney decides, yeah, I am going to stick my neck out for Hallie. I'm going to go to bat in a conversation around promotions and say she deserves it, right? And this is why, and I have firsthand information, but she's not my manager. And that's where I think mentorship or sponsorship or coaching can be really helpful, is getting that outside perspective. And again, thinking about psychological safety. Your manager is not just responsible for coaching you, but they're responsible to their manager for the work that you've done under them. And so they've got some skin in the game here. It's helpful to have that outside perspective who can, really be honest and authentic and sometimes candid and direct. I think those are really useful things as well, but able to kind of really, really give that advice without the skin in the game.
And Sidney, I'm curious if you've had any experience with mentorship or sponsorship in your career, whether being the recipient of that or being a mentor yourself.
Absolutely. I have had several mentors. I would credit mentorship with helping me to understand the corporate landscape, understand interactions with peers, particularly coming from education into moving into a career as a young professional. I do believe that mentorship really helped to make that transition a little bit easier for me in terms of just understanding how to navigate through my career and through the space as a new technologist. My mentors have been primarily men. And I know there's a lot of conversations around, should you look for female mentors? Should you have male mentors? What's the difference? For me, it has been helpful to have male mentors because I think as Lucinda and Hallie have called out, there's a different mindset that they have. And understanding that mindset actually helps you to better navigate the terrain in a predominantly male environment. So it has its benefits. I do think there are also, of course, benefits to being mentored by a woman as well. In terms of the mentorship journey, what really helped me pull out from that is being able to better understand dynamics within teams, better understand how to navigate the leadership journey and becoming a leader. So I was interested very early on in becoming a leader in the field. And I do not believe that I would have successfully navigated that in the way that I did if I did not have those mentors. And to Hallie's point, giving me very candid feedback about how I can improve, what it's like to build a high performing team, how to coach and mentor my direct reports. So I think all of that knowledge, and my mentors typically were executives, mid-level career individuals who had already gone on that journey of introspection and learning how to become a leader, so they could pass those things off to me. And as a result, I believe very strongly in mentorship. I have been a mentor to, and I have primarily focused my mentorship on women, just because when I entered the field again, there were not very many women to mentor, specifically within leadership. And we've talked about this a lot, but as you start to rise in the ranks, that delineation between who sits at that C-suite, who sits at that executive suite, it gets smaller and smaller in terms of representation. So I do think it's very important for mentors to call out to their mentees that journey and that exploration of wanting to climb the corporate ladder to eventually become a C-suite executive.
If I might just also add and kind of we've talked about mentors. Usually they're thought of as people more senior than you, but some of my best mentors have been peers, and they have been brainstorming partners, and they've been people who can imagine themselves being in my shoes and kind of able to talk through that. And so I just want to recognize that sometimes it's, real easy to turn to the person next to you who is in a similar position, going through something similar, and think about them as a mentor as well.
Absolutely. I just want to pose a question maybe to each of you. Obviously, there are so many issues touching on diversity in STEM, but I'm curious in this particular moment, if you had to distill this down to one issue, what do you think would be the single most important concern that you have regarding diversity in tech, or the single most important measure to take when it comes to building inclusive culture? I don't know if Lucinda wants to start first. I know it's a big question.
No, I feel like I'm sitting on the front row and the teacher just asked a really hard question. That's tough. I guess I would say, for me, it comes down to influence. I'm an innovator myself. I was an R&D vice president at Bell Labs, and I'm a patent holder. And it is deeply concerning to me that a lot of the technology products and services we use today created by one homogeneous group of people. And I'm not saying they're bad. I love my technology, and just try to take it away from me, I would be very angry with you. But think about what we're leaving on the table. Think about what the world's leaving on the table. We'd be solving different problems, and we'd be solving problems differently. And so I think it comes down to influence in terms of impact on the world, impact on the country, and impact on those who are underrepresented as well, because with influence, also known as power, you can shape a discipline, you can shape the problem set, and you can have creative, well-paying jobs. And so to me, I think the word is influence.
Sidney, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I think what Lucinda just said really resonated with me. I think it's influence. And I would also say thinking outside of the box. There are ways of working that exist today that were created by that homogenous group that Lucinda just mentioned. And the biggest influence I think we can have is, how do we actually, I don't want to say teach, but how do we motivate women to feel comfortable with redefining systems? Because I think that is where the biggest change is going to come. So one of my pet peeves when I go to diversity events and people talk about it is they say, oh, and they try to get you to adapt to what exists today as a woman. And I think that is incorrect. I think that in order for us to advance and again, to build technologies that are inclusive of the depth and breadth of the true human experience, which is not just one group, we have to start thinking about designing new systems, new ways of thinking, new ways of moving, rather than saying, well, as a woman, operate within these confines and you will be successful. I think that is the wrong way to look at it. And quite often, we are taught as women to work within the system, to adapt our behaviors to work in the system that already exists. And the system that already exists is inherently flawed. So now the question is how do we build something better over time? It won't be perfect. It will also have flaws as well. But how do we build something that is more inclusive of all of us, more representative of different mindsets, different lived experiences than what we have today? And we can't do that by working in the structures that created this lack of diversity.
Definitely. Hallie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think influence is needed, right? And certainly the drive to change, but I think the resisting force is the fear of change. And I think that's one of the biggest obstacles to making real progress in this space. Now, at face value, many of us believe in this. We deeply believe in this work, and we still have implicit biases that lead us to do things. Just the other day, I said, oh, I have a blind spot. And I was like, oh, nope, that's not the right word. And then another day I said, those jobs are white collar. And I was like, oh my gosh, what? And I call myself out, and I call myself out loud, because I work in this day in and day out. I think about it all the time. I pride myself on how invested I am in being an advocate, an ally, a change maker. And I still make mistakes. And I think recognizing that is really important, and not having that fear of saying the wrong thing, because we're all going to say the wrong thing. But how we, as the underrepresented women in technology, or the underrepresented groups, have that fear in ourselves. And then on the other side is, the fear of the white men, that if things change and are more inclusive, will they be at a disadvantage? Will they be giving up some of that power and influence that we are aspiring so hard to get? And so I think, again, kind of going back to that psychological safety I talked about earlier, it's fear that limits us. And so the more we can kind of come together to motivate each other to feel empowered, the better we're all going to be.
All very great points and very thoughtful answers. So thank you, everyone. And we are now going to pivot to some questions from the audience. I first have a question for Lucinda. Dejan, sorry, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, says, as a male working in tech, what are some of the best ways I can encourage more women to join this field?
So joining the field, let's talk first a little bit about the educational pipeline for just a minute, because of course that's where a lot of people enter any particular discipline or field, but not entirely. We don't have time to talk about all different ways people can join. There are a lot of things you can do, and we have information on our website, ncwit.org, about encouraging rigorous, relevant, inclusive computer science education in your school districts. And we've got to have that as a country, absolutely have to. So everybody should be thinking about how can they work within their local school districts, educational systems, to encourage that. There's been a lot of progress over the last 10 years, lots of organizations working in this space to get that kind of curriculum out there. So you will have plenty to work from in terms of, and I'm not saying only encouraging those who identify as girls. I'm talking about encouraging all students, to study computer science. And then maybe just one final pitch, because I want to go back to what Hallie said. It's not just the pipeline. And so other things that we want everybody to do, and certainly male allies, would be to work within their organizations and teams to implement inclusivity. And there are, again, we have resources, others do too, on how to do that. But just to reiterate, pay attention who speaks, people's voices being heard, monitor interruptions. These are all very simple things, monitor interruptions. And this doesn't have to go slowly either. So please don't hear this as, oh, we're never going to get out of that meeting. And what if that person never stops talking? Right? Just monitor, and pay attention to that. Use a spirit of inquiry to make sure people are having those honest conversations that we've been talking about, and that they're communicating. And then lastly, learn a few things. You can spend an hour and learn social science principles, that will serve you very well in this space. So in the same way you might be learning about cloud computing or, some other technology, we've got them. Everybody's got these resources. You can take an hour, you can read, and then you too will know micro inequities, stereotype threat, et cetera, and you'll be able to put a name on things. And once you can put a name on behaviors, you actually feel safer about how to deal with them.
Our next question is for Hallie. Brian asks, what are the biggest trends you have seen in terms of barriers that women and minorities face in tech? And how have people gotten around these barriers?
It's a great question, and it's a hard question because I don't think we can see the barriers. And that's the biggest challenge. If it was real easy, if we knew the biggest problems, we'd just pick them up and move them out of the way, right? But some of the barriers that I've really seen are around career movement and progression through I hate to say career ladder these days, because I really believe it's a jungle gym, but moving up in your career. And I'll tell a story about a session I once sat in where this became really, really clear to me. And my job in this session was to be kind of an unbiased, somebody to sit in the room and call people out if they, said something that might have been like a rock star, which is a commonly gendered term to describe men, right? But in this session, it was a discussion around promotions, and there was a group of people who were, part of the discussion, and all but one were white. And the last person was a person of color. And in the end of the discussion, all of the white people were being promoted, and the person of color was not. And I went to the person kind of running the session, and I said, did you notice this? And their first instinct was to say, oh, no, that's not why, right? That person just wasn't performing as well. And so they couldn't, right? Like they couldn't be promoted. It wasn't because that they were Black. It was because that they were not performing, right? But how do we define performing? And what is equity? And what are the experiences that person had leading up to this point in time so that they could be successful in that role? And are the visions of what success looks like white male visions, right? And they're not inclusive of what it might look like for this particular person, right? And I didn't know the characters at play here. And so I could only bring it to light. But it was the discomfort that person felt immediately to justify. And so those are the kinds of barriers, again, coming back to fear, and the way around them, I think is twofold. One is you be more like the white people. I don't think that's the right way around them, but I do think that is how some people have gotten around them, that they act more like the majority. And as we said, the technology that is built is largely built by white men. And so if you can use it and adapt to it, those systems in place, you might be more successful. I think the other way around it is really to continue to challenge the status quo and rebuild. And this is certainly not an easy thing to do, but I think we're at a really pivotal point in the way that we work. The future of work, I've heard the future of work is now. I really don't believe that. I think we're moving to hybrid and remote, and that's a piece of it. But I really think that the way we talk about employees is changing, and the way that we work is truly going to change. And I think, if I could take a blank piece of paper and start from scratch, I think that's the point we're almost at. We're still going to have to tear down the systems that were at play, but I really hope to see feedback becoming such a more dynamic part of the cycle. I really hope to see representation in that we have multiple models of what success looks like. It is not just this single model that we're all being evaluated against today. So it's definitely an effort, but I hope we're having this conversation again 10 years from now with a very different story.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point you made about some of those defensive responses and kind of opening those conversations in a way that seems more constructive. And then we have a question for Sidney. Ritika says, who has inspired you to reach the level of success that you have reached, and how did they do it?
So I'm going to give a very non-traditional answer to this question. I would say myself. And here's why, because quite often, I would say in American culture, we are taught to look outside of ourselves for inspiration. And that dynamic causes you to feel as if maybe there's something missing that you don't have in terms of being able to motivate yourself. And so for me, I came from an adverse background. I did not come from a family that had technologists or college educated degree, laden type of parents. So for me, it's been a real journey of self-exploration to move throughout my educational experience, throughout my corporate experience. And I really feel as if I motivated myself because I knew that I had potential, and I knew that I could become what I wanted to become in terms of my dreams, my aspirations, my goals. But I also saw that I felt that my journey was uniquely different from a lot of my peers. And so when I looked outside of myself to see who could motivate me, I really didn't see anyone that had the same background and could motivate me more than myself. And so I chose to kind of say, like, okay, I need to have this motivation internally to make these dreams come true. And it's not necessarily saying that I haven't looked to others. Like I said, I've had mentors. I have people within technology that inspire me, Elon Musk and people like that, who are just like, wow, like just the way they think is so incredibly fascinating to me. But my internal motivation, I believe, has been the key to my success. Keeping that fire burning within me to keep learning, keep exploring, keep growing, to continue advancing my career to the next level. I don't necessarily have anyone outside of myself pushing me to do that. So that drive is coming from within to say, I want to be a CEO one day, and I want to build my own company one day, and I want to do this and this. And so I would just round it out with, it's okay to know that the motivation is within you. I think actually the motivation is within all of us to inspire ourselves to achieve great things. And I would just encourage you to really start searching for that and looking for that fire and that drive within yourself, and look to that for your inspiration, as well as looking at others in your particular industry or field as well.
Awesome. What a great answer. I think we are coming to a close of the panel. This concludes all of our questions. I want to thank the audience for attending today and the panelists for their participation and wonderful insights. Thank you so much, guys. Please come back for the next panel, which will discuss how female senior leaders in STEM and tech have cleared the hurdles to reach success in their careers.